All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's just gone 5 p.m., so we'll make a start. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Just some introductions first, please. I'd like to warmly welcome Estiani Marks from Lightstone. Estiani is a consultant with Lightstone, and we'll let her just introduce the services and scope of Lightstone in a moment. Also joining us, as before, Karine Kutsia, my colleague from Cape Town. Karine is Trafalgar's property management consultant and widely involved with supporting our portfolio teams with legal and advisory support. And Peter Menon, also based in Cape Town, Trafalgar's head of legal and marketing. Just a couple of introductory comments. A reminder that we have a lot of training content freely available on our training website, which is training.trafalgar.coza. We do really try and make as much useful and relevant training content available as we feasibly can. There's a lot of useful content there. For example, any particular topic or many particular topics that are important, that are recurring, that are topical, you would likely find a webinar covering that topic. You would likely find slides and relevant information, and you would likely find questions of the week, which Karine writes up each and every week, speaking about that particular topic, the relevant legislation, and a particular recommendation that links to it. So there is generally useful content to find linked to any particular topic that might be a challenge to you and your scheme. And if it's not covered, then by all means, Karine's details and my details and Peter's details will be given at the end. You're more than welcome to reach out to this to respond, and we will take the cue to then add those topics to the questions of the week. And we typically then also link those into our monthly newsletter. So, please do have a look there. We've also put the legislation that is relevant to community schemes in a searchable Word format on the training website. So it does allow you to search on keywords, to search on topics, and to quickly find and navigate relevant topics in the legislation, again, which is useful information and context if you are confronting a particular challenge and do want to find legislation that may be relevant to it. So just a reminder what's there for you. In the chat, please just do leave your email. You can just send it privately if you want, and we'll take that as a cue to send you copies of the slides and recording, likely on Monday, once those are updated and formatted. So that will be available to anyone that adds an email address into the chat. We are recording the webinar really just for training reference purposes. It will be linked on our training website, as I mentioned, and it's there just for record purposes and for others to use and see as well. There'll be a short survey that just pops up at the end. If you wouldn't mind just completing it, it'll take 10 to 15 seconds just to let us know what you thought about the webinar and an opportunity to give suggestions for other topics you would like us to cover with our monthly training webinar series. So those are the introductory comments I'd like to make today. We will finish promptly by 6, and Karine and I will endeavor to answer any questions in the chat if you have any that crop up during the course of the discussion with Estiani and Peter. Tonight we've got a slightly different theme and topic, which we hope you'll find interesting. We're going to ask Estiani just to give us a quick scan of the property sector, the residential property sector in particular across South Africa, just looking at some relevant stats, geographical distribution, price bands, etc., just to give you a flavor for how does the property market and sector look in South Africa at the moment, and what is the growth trend outlook for some of those. In the process, you'll get a feel for what information Lightstone offers online, how it could be useful to property owners, property investors, and I think Estiani and Peter might just talk about, if you were considering buying or selling a property, what information on Lightstone might be useful to you to do some home research, to do desktop research, to create context, and to give you a lead on, potential discussions you might have with estate agents or others about investing or selling a property. And it's very useful to know what information and reports are available and accessible online. And I'm sure Estiani will talk to us about that as well. So thank you again for joining us. And Estiani, may I hand over to you just to give us your overview. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me, and welcome to all the attendees today. So yeah, I think the important thing for me is always, where do we start? Start by understanding the market. We all invest in real estate, so we all have a vested interest in what is happening in the real estate market, and for this forum specifically, the residential property market. So we're having a look today at what is the makeup of the market. So as you can see in the very left-hand side, we're sitting with majority of properties, about 7 million registered residential properties within South Africa, which is quite substantial. And then a portion of that being your commercial properties, about 16%, which is classified as non-residential. Then we also look at what is the makeup or what is the components in terms of the property types segmented into your sectional titles, your estates, and then your normal freestanding freehold. So as you can see in the middle graph, majority of properties still is classified as freehold. Now, where it depends on where you live. If you live in an area that's very dense in terms of sectional titles, you may think, that is the theme across South Africa, which is not. I always used to think that majority of areas have more sectional title units, but it is absolutely not how it is constructed in South Africa. As you can see there, 80% of the properties are still classified as freehold. Only 12% classified as sectional title, or 12.8%, and then 6.8% of those are classified as estates. Now, the interesting part here is you can see that proportionally, estates may be your smallest sector, so only 6.8% in terms of number of properties, but a whopping 18.9% in terms of value. So just a good indication of the value of estates and properties within estates currently in South Africa, but we can talk about that a little bit later. And then just for interest purposes as well, what is the makeup in terms of these properties being bonded versus cash sales? So also a nice slot there or split there in terms of the values. You can see almost 50% of properties being bought in cash and the other 50% bought in terms of being bonded through a financial institution. So if we look at the next slide, which is also quite very interesting for me always to look at, what is the distribution in terms of properties, the values and the makeup, and how that actually brings together our 7 million properties of a value of 7 trillion. So although the resident or the higher end properties make up only 5% in terms of the number of properties, they are actually having a total value of 28%, which is quite substantial. And then on the flip side, we can see that although 24% of our market is in our sort of lower value properties, that only constitutes about 3% of the market value in terms of real estate for South Africa. Karin, then we can look at the next slide. Always also interesting to understand, we have our 7 million properties, but where are they actually based? Where are these properties, actually constructed? And if we look at the graphs there or the map in front of us, we can see that about 35% of properties are actually sitting in Gauteng. And we always say, it's the smallest province with the most properties. So we all live next to each other, which is funny. But second to that, we have the Western Cape sitting with about 18% of all properties, KwaZulu-Natal sitting on about 13%, and then the Eastern Cape with about 10%. And then we have the smaller provinces with less properties in terms of volumes, the Northern Cape, Free State, Northwest Limpopo, and Mpumalanga. And you can also see the split in terms of property values. Now, what's interesting here is if you look at, as an example, KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape, it's remarkable to then look at the volume of properties are actually a little bit more than what the value actually brings in. Whereas in Gauteng and to the Western Cape, it's the other way around. Western Cape very much more so, where although they only have 18% of the number of properties in the country, they make up about 30% in terms of value. So that is quite interesting and something to keep in mind. Thank you, Corinne. Then on the next slide, it's just having a look, over the last 10 years, 10, 11 odd years, what are the sort of properties that are actually brought onto the market? So what we can see here is freehold has always been the majority of properties. It's also still the majority of properties that are actually being constructed and brought onto the market. So that, I think, is something that will probably not change in the very near future, but it's remarkable to see how sectional titles have actually increased in terms of market stock being brought onto the market over the last 10, 11 years. So that is something I think will continue to grow, and it's always based on demand. So we do see that the demand for sectional titles are still very healthy, and similar to that is your estates. So in the green line, you can see there's also a nice big influx of estates being constructed into the market. We all see our little COVID dip, so that is inevitable, where not a lot have happened in the market, but other than that, a nice increase in terms of properties constructed. Farms less so, but that is, I think, for obvious reasons. All right, so then we look at, we bring our news, well, for today specifically, we look at estates, sectional titles, and we also wanted to understand, what is in terms of proportionally for provinces, where are these actually brought on? So we know that there's more sectional titles being brought onto the market than estates, and we wanted to have a look at where are these actually constructed. And as you can see, majority still in the Gauteng area. The second to that, Western Cape. But what's nice to see is the changes in the smaller provinces, where there's always this cycle of properties that or areas that actually gets a little bit of an uplift, and there's a real a revival in a specific area. And then sectional titles, in this instance, or estates, gets constructed in those areas, and it actually lifts the demand quite a bit and influence the property prices and what people need in that specific area. So we can see here on the specific graphs the nice changes there for the northwest area. I know for many in Gauteng, also being mindful of what's happening sort of near your Harties areas, and a lot of change that has happened there. So it's interesting to look at what is happening in these specific provinces and how that drives what type of properties are being brought onto the market. All right, now this is, like I always call this our spaghetti bolognese. It's a very busy slide, but what it ultimately tells us is when we look at property prices, and in this specific instance is how does the house price performance actually, before the house prices perform over time in South Africa, and it's very depending on what is happening in the markets. Now we all know, if we look at the prominent red line being your Western Cape area, we all know that the demand for properties in the Western Cape has been relatively high for a relatively long time. So up until when we saw that whole COVID period there in 2019, the demand was quite high, and which resulted in quite high inflation or house price increases in that specific area. On the flip side, we also have areas that have not done so well, unfortunately, like areas such as, for example, Gauteng hasn't had that great increase in terms of performance for house prices. But then when we look at areas such as the Eastern Cape, for example, when we saw COVID happening, so towards your 2019, 2020, 2021, people have had the opportunity, to sort of re-look their lives, re-look at where they actually stay, where they are based, and where they could work from. And there was a nice big influx into our Eastern Cape areas, which caused the properties in those areas to actually increase quite a bit in terms of value. Similar to that, your areas such as Mpumalanga, And all of these little small town areas that had such a nice influx in terms of people that preferred staying in those types of towns and alternative types of living as opposed to staying in the metros. But then also what we have seen is natural elements such as for areas such as KwaZulu-Natal. I think we all are very familiar with what happened there in terms of natural and disaster, or let's call it disasters, which unfortunately also will have a negative impact on house price increases in those areas. But yeah, always interesting to see where things are changing, where the demand is changing, and obviously then the supply will follow suit where people are actually constructing new properties. Cool. Then the next slide, we're looking at what is the value bands that are performing well. Now, these, again, very volatile in a specific market that we're currently in, very long cycle. But what we do see is in about 2012 to 2018, or let's go about 2015, actually, is when the luxury market started to take quite a bit of strain. So that's your higher price properties. Your low value properties have always been very stable in terms of value increases. And we also saw a nice big increase in terms of your mid-value to high-value property prices. So post-COVID, we had that whole big boom of properties that, because people re-looked at what they actually use their properties for. And there was a nice increase in the market in terms of property sales and in terms of property prices. But then obviously we are sitting with issues such as high interest rates, and we could actually see the effect of that quite a bit in 2013. And I think we'll speak about that a little bit later, just to see what the outlook is and where we are currently. So, Karine, we can move on to the next slide. All right, so the next slide is actually just an indication of the national house price performance in terms of sectional title versus freehold. And as you can see, there was a nice big sort of change in the market around 2003, 2004, where a lot of sectional titles were introduced into the market. And there's actually been a bigger increase in prices for sectional title proportionally than freehold, although that have corrected itself again. And freehold still seems to attract or attain a little bit of a better house price performance than sectional title. Again, various reasons for, but it's not to say that sectional title is not a preferred a property type for certain individuals or certain asset classes and also demographics. And the next slide, you can move to the next slide, which actually talks about these demographics, which I'm referring to. And when we look at the slide here, you'll see that for estates, as an example, we can see on the left-hand side that majority of our buyers or people that buys with or into estates are actually in the age groups of 36 to 49-year-olds. So very what we call economically active people. Not a lot of our pensioners that are actually moving into estates as proportionally. And then also what we see is quite a bit of youngsters that are in that area, although there's a bit of a decrease in terms of these youngsters moving into estates, and again, can speak to affordability, which is something that I think we all are very much aware of at the moment. And then top right, we can also look at, what is the makeup of these buyers into estates. And as you can see, the majority are people that have bought properties before. So what we call our repeat buyers. So typically start off with, let's say, as an example, a freehold or freestanding freehold or a sectional title unit, and then upgrading into an estate. As opposed to starting off within an estate from the stance, where that picture is a little bit different for sectional titles. In the next slide, we'll see that there's quite a big proportion of people that are actually moving or buying into estates, sectional titles as a first-time home buyer, as opposed to a repeat buyer. And the profile or the demographic profile of our buyers into sectional title is quite different. There you can see its majority being our youngsters, so younger than 35 years of age. And then also our 36 to 64-year-olds that are actually buying into sectional titles. All right, so just a quick overlook in terms of, what is valuable for property value, property buyers, property sellers. So in the Lightstone bouquet of reports, we've got 2 reports that are actually giving you great insights if you are in the market to buy or sell a property, and looking at what these parameters are. So first of all, understanding what is the market value of your property currently, and that is based on various factors, but giving you a nice overview of what the estimated value is for your property, which will in turn help you either as a buyer or a seller to have sort of a realistic expectation in terms of what property prices are actually going for at the moment. Then also in the next slide, you'll see that in terms of acquiring a property, we all know that there's a cost involved for any buyers into real estate. So what is the cost that you would possibly or probably have to factor in when you are buying into a specific property? So your bond cost, your transfer cost, and then also your estimated monthly cost if you are to buy a unit or a house within an estate. Next slide. So understanding if you are able to, pay a little bit more towards your bond, what the total savings will be in terms of interest of your bond acquired. And also then very important for investors into real estate is understanding the return on investment. So just a little bit of a view of what is your 1-year growth looking like, and then also what is the 5-year growth percentage looking like for your property as opposed to the suburb that it's based in, and just a 1-year property value forecast, which will give you a good indication of what to expect. Okay, the next slide. All right, so again, for investors, very important to understand, and property owners, I mean, we all buy into real estate for various different reasons. So for an investor, you would typically want to understand what is the investability for properties in your area that you're actually buying into. So as an example, what is the proportion of property debt for that area? Is it an area where people are typically over indebted, not maintaining properties well, looking at possible repossessions, those kind of things which could have a negative effect on value of properties in that area. Demand, what is the demand of properties in a specific area? And that could also lead to, a higher sales price where the demand is quite high. House price growth, so understanding and have a good view of what is the house price growth for properties in that area, for you to make informed decisions. Is it a good time to buy? Is it a good time to sell? And then as a property investor, actually staying in that property, you want to also understand what is your level of access to amenities, because that is a driving factor, one of the driving factors of people deciding where to actually acquire property. Then also looking at I think I've got 1 or 2 slides left. So looking at the national property inflation and where we are currently. So as you can see, we're sitting on about almost 3% for the current year. So the current annual property inflation, which means that on average, property prices increase with about 3% currently, which is, it's not ideal. I think, speaking as property as an asset, it's really, if you look at just the 3%, it may not sound very, very, very great for you as an investor or property owner. But I think it's important to take this into context to understand that this is across a national level. And there's areas that are performing very well. Specifically, what we have seen is some estates. So estates still is one of the preferred property types for people to stay in for various reasons and factors. And we've seen some estates that have actually acquired quite a high inflation rate, up to about 18-19%, which is phenomenal. And yeah, as you can see, still a positive national inflation. And I think there's an analysis that has been done to say that within the last 50 years, I think there was only 3 years where property had a negative return. So again, still very, very lucrative and a good, for me at least, my preferred asset or vehicle of investment. So yeah, great to see that it's still in an upward trend, but I guess there's things that we need to take into consideration there. And then lastly, just to understand again, what's happening over a long period of time. And what we frequently also come across and see is that a province may not do as well. So as an example, let's look at Gauteng as a province. Yes, the growth rate may not be that great for the province itself, but many a times it's not the entire province. It can just be certain areas or municipalities within a province that is taking strain, and for various reasons. It can be that it's not maintained well, it's not managed well. It can also be that there's been a lot of natural disasters. So there's various reasons to look at, why property prices are not increasing in line with what we want to expect. But as you can see, and I've mentioned that in a slide before, the low value properties have had phenomenal growth over a period of time. And we see that, properties in the very lower price band are actually phasing out. So not being available in the market as much as it used to be. And that's just because the property prices grow on an annual basis, especially in the low value band. And then at the very bottom, we can see the difference between, as an example, freehold and sectional title. So just to see that, there are still some areas that are performing extremely well in terms of price growth in certain areas and certain property types.
Thank you very much, Estiani. Before we head into the Q&A, I just want to remind all the participants you are more than welcome to ask your questions in the chat. So please keep them coming. We do have around about 10 prep questions that we sent through to Estiani beforehand, but I'm going to try and catch you out on a lot of these, Estiani. I promise I will. Especially the first one. Hey, so your wish list for the cabinet? No, okay. So let's start with some politics. How does Lightstone see the GNU affecting sales, property economy, and pricing at the moment? And I know it's difficult to sort of give an indication of what a company's feelings are towards this. Perhaps your personal comments here.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I think this is going to be more my personal opinion. But look, I think similar to everybody else on this beautiful continent or in country of ours, I think we're all holding thumbs that the right decisions are being made at the moment, so that we do have a fully functioning government that can actually take this country forward. And yeah, it's a very interesting time to be around. I think nobody can disagree with that. It can go either way. Be hoping for things to go in the right direction. But what I do find and what I do think is that we have sort of reached a point where things sort of can only go better from here. We've seen only also in terms of the interest rates, the overall global sentiment is that it's well perceived. The elections has been well perceived, and the markets are starting to sort of respond positively to that. And that we're hoping that the next element will be our interest rates that will be affected or positively affected by this. And the indications are that it may actually start decreasing sooner than what we have expected, which I think is a valuable thing to look forward to, because property prices, prices in general has been quite high for a long period of time. So yeah, I think there's a lot that still happens. I think that even if you look at the news, it changes almost by the hour. Which is very interesting to watch. But yeah, let's see what the outcome is. I personally think it will be positive.
I love that positive outlook. And even before I asked this question, you said property, positive investment, your investment vehicle of choice. So coming off one of the chats, does Lightstone have an API or a raw data export that you can utilize? So I'm guessing this is into a property management system, etc.
Yeah, so look, I mean, it depends really on what the use case is, but that the individual is very welcome to give me or to connect with me. We do have APIs for certain products and services. Yeah, it's been utilized in various systems already. So yeah, happy to connect afterwards.
Excellent. And obviously integration into credit bureaus, etc. You guys do those as well through that API platform. In an ideal world, what are the individual elements required for the property market to realize its full potential? This we can probably speak about for an hour.
Yeah, ideal world, everybody has a roof over their heads, I guess, would be my first choice of, what an ideal world would look like. But I think, at the end of the day, we do have a shortage of housing, which in itself provides a lot of opportunity. So for me, I think if the environment is lucrative enough and accessible enough for properties to be introduced into the market, that for me would be first price. I think we're all aware of all the components to that, but yeah, and I've mentioned it at the beginning as well, people should see property as an asset class. It's for most of us, for majority of South Africans, it's the biggest investment we'll ever make. And it certainly does come at a price. So, you would want to make sure that the property market remains stable at all times, and that value is not lost in any areas. It doesn't matter actually where that sits. So for me, that would be ideal, is that, the legislation is put in place to make sure that, for us at least, the process is robust. And I think we actually do have one of the best processes in the world in terms of property, the deeds registry, so it's very robust, and it should be maintained at all cost.
Yeah, as long as we can move into some form of electronic signature in the coming future, I think it's going to really impact it substantially. Yeah. What are some current trends you have picked up on affecting the likelihood of sale and price in community schemes?
So, I think every scheme has its own identity, let's call it that, which obviously of most importance is the maintenance of these schemes. Nobody wants to buy into a scheme just to get a surprise in terms of cost and maintenance of that scheme in the near future. So for me, I think that's vital, because as I've mentioned, it's an asset. You need to make sure that the asset you acquire is actually well maintained. And then obviously, pricing and affordability. So yeah, I think we do see that a lot of youngsters move into these sectional title units just because of affordability and access to the market. So it's very important also, and I think the next question speaks to that, is to, especially for people that are developing these schemes, is to understand what is the market demand, what is the demographics of people that are actually living in sectional schemes, moving in and out of sectional schemes. And I'm not saying all sectional schemes are people or youngsters. Every sectional scheme have got their own sort of elements that's happening within that scheme, and it may be that a sectional scheme is situated near a primary school, as an example. There you'll have more younger people staying because of access to those kind of amenities. So I think that also is something that would affect, demand is access to amenities within a relative, close what's the word? Close proximity to that specific sectional scheme.
And I think just picking up on what you said that there regarding sort of demographics and LSM, and specifically developing sectional title estates for specific areas. With the implementation of SPLUMA at the moment, you can see that across the board with the developers, they are having a look at the different products and packaging like that as well. So yeah, from a development perspective, that diversity is incredibly important.
Yeah.
Lightstone has a sectional title scheme report. I'm not going to ask you to bring up the report now, but what does that report contain? Does it give a lot of information regarding the specific scheme? I know you can't necessarily go into things like the arrears, obviously, that's been held there, but what type of data do you put into that sectional title scheme report?
So for us, what we look at, if we look at a sectional scheme, is to first of all understand, what is the scheme makeup, so the number of living units, and then also who is the current owner, so that's important. But then also understanding the demographics again of a sectional scheme. So is it how long? Well, there's certain elements. The first one would be how long do people in that specific sectional scheme actually hold on to their properties before they sell off? Do they stay generally more than 10 years, 0 to 5 years? And what is the sort of time frame in which majority stays or keeps that property? And then also looking at the age. So again, is it people that are a little bit younger staying in a sectional scheme? Is it majority your retirees staying in the sectional scheme? So understanding how that changes over time. And I think that also gives a nice indication to trustees, as within a sectional scheme and similar to an estate, of what is the demographics of that scheme and what elements would make sense to actually have available in that scheme, whether it be technology, whether it be amenities. In an older sectional scheme, they may want to have a little bit more movability or your recreational elements, whereas in a younger scheme you would want to have more technology and those kind of elements. So I think it's important for trustees to understand that, because that ultimately will increase demand, in my view, and demand will increase value and property prices.
What we've picked up on over the last couple of months is the sustainability element coming into this as well. And for all our participants, we are going to be having a webinar specifically on sustainability in community schemes, what's important at the moment. Perhaps things like solar, the water issue comes up a lot in specific areas as well. And we'll certainly showcase that through the coming months as well. Just one off the Q&A. Firstly, can an individual owner, any one of us, access Lightstone, create an account and draw reports?
Yes, no, certainly. We do have once-off reports available. So on the website, you just purchase a report. You don't have to have a subscription to be able to obtain this information. There obviously are some elements that's not available to non-subscribers, but in general, all the important reports for property owners are available on our website. Yes.
Fantastic. And sorry for asking you this one. It is a cash-related question, but how much do those reports cost?
So it actually depends on the type of report. So as an example, you can obtain a property valuation report for 150 Rand. So again, if you think what the cost really is to get a valuer out, it's very, attractive to individuals just wanting to understand the value of their property at the moment, not necessarily to sell. Or to buy a new property, but understanding and also having a look at, how that actually grow over a period of time. So always nice to just keep on top of what's happening. So that's an idea, but there's obviously, I want to say some reports that cost a little bit less, such as your suburb report or your estate report. So just having a general understanding of what's happening in your scheme, it's also available.
Is that report going to include things like previous deeds transfers, who the previous owners were as well?
No, so I think the important part here, and it's one of the questions that I guess you still will ask, but it's around POPI, and how the POPI Act actually affect property information and ownership information. So in our reports, we do have the ability for people to see, who was the previous owners to a certain extent. But, you need to have, so to obtain personal information, you need to have a legitimate reason why you're doing that. So we don't necessarily just display that as a norm on, let's say, on our portals where everybody can just access those. We also do have reports where there's no personal information. So if you just want to understand the market, you don't necessarily need to understand who actually bought properties before you, even for, you know, for that specific property, to understand the value. But if there's a need for understanding who the previous owners are, then yes, there's certain reports that do make that information available.
Yeah, from our own personal perspective, every property that I've sold, I've utilized the Lightstone report before even contacting the agent. It just gives you that baseline of where you're sort of heading at the moment.
Yeah, a realistic expectation. I think that's what we aim for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Corinne, will you skip slide for me, please? Thank you. And then possibly let's start with 7, because we did touch on Poppy now. But what is the source of the Lightstone information? And you just told us it's not going to give you ID numbers and possibly even contact details, and names of owners, etc. But where does Lightstone get their data from?
So the primary source for Lightstone is the deeds. We obtained deeds records directly from the deeds office, and that is sort of the basis of what the Lightstone offering is made up of. But then, you know, we utilize the various sources such as Stats SA. We also have reports, which is quite interesting, is your property risk report, is to understand what is the crime element. So that obviously, you know, comes from your South African Police Services. We have stats on what is the soil type for a specific area, which for me is also always very prominent in sectional titles, and certain areas where there's a lot of dolomite or there's a lot of clay soil, and you want to understand what are the type of risks that you actually can look at. So those are the type of property, well, let's call it data sets that we actually incorporate into our reports. But yeah, we also do incorporate the municipal valuation roles, so understanding what is the property classified as in terms of usage, because remember, that's also very important. Even if it's a sectional scheme or an estate, it's classified as a specific usage in terms of what you can and can't do, and also the rates and taxes attached or to each one of these properties. So yeah, there's various data sources that we actually incorporate, but our foundation is the deeds. We work off deeds, yeah.
Anybody who's purchased a house in Centurion would know this full report is probably one of the most important ones that you're looking for. Hey?
Definitely.
So just having a look at you've obviously got a plethora of reports available through the site. But will you just take us through a couple that might be applicable to community schemes or possibly potential sellers and purchasers of property?
Yeah, definitely. So we've got 2 valuation reports, the property value seller and the property value buyer, which I've touched on before, super valuable. And then we also have just mentioned the property risk report. So again, you know, just for understanding what is the risk that is possibly attached to you making a purchase. And sometimes there isn't. It's also good to know that there isn't a great risk. And that can be anything such as, you know, access or close proximity to a water body, to fire danger. And, you know, it's always difficult to picture these if you are sitting and are based in a specific area. You know, you've mentioned Centurion now. I'm also based in Centurion, but, you know, so it's difficult for us to imagine water damage from the ocean or from a big water body, because, you know, it's not in our framework. But look at what happened in the Knysna area, you know, with the fires, and I think it was 2017. So total devastation. And you want to understand what your risk is in any type of property and be able to mitigate that quite a bit, whether it is, you know, how you construct your roof or what your perimeter needs to look like, whatever that is. So yeah, the property risk report for me is very valuable. And then your suburb reports. I think the suburb report is something that, you know, any owner in a specific suburb, again, whether you're a property investor or a property owner where you actually stay in that property, you need to understand what's happening in your suburb. You know, at the end of the day, you need to understand when it's a good time to invest in an area and a good time to maybe sell in the area. And it's not necessarily that, you know, you need to sell because the areas, the values are going down. It can be that values are actually going up and you can obtain a good, you know, a good value for your property or good price. So definitely the suburb reports, I think, is very valuable. And also, you know, if you want to buy into a community scheme, I always say that, you know, when I used to do work a lot with the community scheme purchases, is, you know, the banks would typically or sometimes say that a bond cannot be obtained in a specific scheme or estate because the financials of that estate doesn't look good, or it's not well maintained, or whatever the case may be. Where on our scheme reports, you can actually see we've got a graph to show and indicate where and when a specific financial institution have actually reached sort of their limit of risk in that specific sectional scheme. So it's important to understand, if let's say Standard Bank is a little bit over invested in sectional scheme ABC, they will start declining bonds in that specific scheme, and not because the scheme is not maintained well or the buyer doesn't have a good credit profile. It's just their risk in that area is just too high, and they'll start decreasing providing financial aid or bonds in that specific scheme or estate. And it's always good to understand that, especially as a buyer, understanding where you'll be able to get financial assistance. And I think those are, for me, one of the 4 most important reports, 4 or 5 for sectional schemes and estates.
Excellent, thank you. Touching on what we've spoken about previously, prognosis for 5 years, we're not going to keep you to this, but you are the person with the data at the end of the day. So trends are always going to be cyclical in a certain way, but the prognosis for sectional title schemes for estate living, would you say that those are going to be in the increase in the next 5 years if you're having a look at the data currently?
My immediate answer would be yes, especially estates. What we have seen is, people are wanting that kind of lifestyle. And again, it's about lifestyle. So you want to feel safe. You want to be able to have certain, I want to call it amenities, but certain elements within a close proximity that you can actually enjoy and engage in. So estates, I think, is something that, becomes a little bit expensive, if I can call it that way, for a certain market, just because there's such a high demand for properties in estates. And then on the other side, also, what's very interesting to watch is the rental market. So there's, our youngsters, for us, I'm not part of the youngsters anymore, unfortunately, but, when we started off in our real estate journey, we wanted to we were happy to eat beans and rice for the longest time, as long as you can buy that property. Where the youngsters today, for them, it's like, oh no, I want to pack up and go whenever I'm happy to not have a property. They're investing their money in non-fungible tokens. We don't even know what that is, so the landscape's changing quite a bit. And people the younger generations seem to be more inclined to rent properties than buy properties, and also I think due to affordability. So let's be honest, there's a lot of affordability issues, and also but I wanted to say there's a lot of people that don't have work. The unemployment is quite high in South Africa. So, access to be able to buy these properties become problematic, and people tend to rent. So what I'm thinking is that, especially in your sectional title environment, we may actually see more investment, more investors buying into sectional titles and then having to be, or being able to rent that out. But yeah, I can't see that there will be a decrease in demand. Obviously needs to be maintained well, rates kept at a decent level and affordable level. I think that is what I see it in the next 5 years.
Good prognosis, thank you. Excellent. What are your top tips for increasing values of properties in community schemes? If you're having a look at the data, what sells, what doesn't sell?
Location, I think that's one of the questions you also had. Obviously, location to certain amenities. It's not always something that a sectional scheme have any control over, but certainly I think for developers to understand that people need to be close to certain amenities. So definitely that, and also understanding, you know, what is the bigger picture for a specific area. So yes, it may be that there aren't any amenities at the moment or services directly available at the moment, but what is the longer term plan for that area? But then also maintenance and upkeep. You know, at the end of the day, as I've mentioned, it's an asset, and you want to make sure that the elements that protects an asset is in place. So good governance, making sure that, you know, your rules and regulations in that specific scheme is relevant to what's happening in the rest of the market. And yeah, I think a healthy financial situation, people do tend to look at, you know, what is happening in the financials of schemes. And also, as you've mentioned, Spluma, I think that's something that's going to come, you know, a bit more relevant in the next few years, where you'll not be able to sell properties if all your plans are not actually 100% in place. So my suggestion again would be make sure that, you know, all these changes that have happened in sectional schemes, knowing, unknowing, are, you know, that the trustees are on top of those, make sure the plans are up to date. Yeah, I think that for me would constitute, you know, some ideas around making sure that the value of that scheme is maintained.
Governance issues and financial issues are all important here, most certainly. Estiani, thank you very much. Andrew, I'm going to hand over to you if you've possibly got any further questions. I don't see anything further coming through from the chat.
Thank you, Peter. Estiani, just a question about renovations. So if I understand the Lightstone methodology correctly, it takes the base purchase price of a property, it will escalate it by the suburb index or the appreciation in a suburb, and it then forecasts the, you know, expected market value on that. It doesn't necessarily know if there's been a renovation or an extension or some sort of adjustment to the footprint of the property. Therefore, you know, the sort of indicative sales price might be misleading in that regard. Is there a way around that in any way?
Look, I think the most important thing will be, you know, what type of a buyer you have if you think about property prices. So the one thing that we do find is that the banks are actually looking at, so if you have a buyer that is actually buying through a bonded institution, so not buying cash, I think therein lies the difficulty in getting that increased value for renovations and you know, changes within a unit, because the banks necessarily or won't necessarily see the value in that, because the market says, you know, we're only getting, as an example, 600,000 for a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom in this area, irrespective of whether you've made certain changes to that unit. It may increase a little bit, but not necessarily to the extent that you would want. Whereas if it's a cash buyer, certainly, you know, whatever that buyer feels is valuable, they're willing to pay the price. So in the Lightstone system, what we do is we obviously have the ability for estate agents to go and have an assessment on a specific property, because the flip side's also true, that, you know, the area is maintained well, other units in the sectional schemes maintained well, but this specific one hasn't, it's dilapidated. And, you know, you would want to be able to or to reduce the price on that specific unit as well. So we give a base estimated value of a property, and then it comes down to the property professional, so your estate agent, to go and have a look at the actual property and make sure that they adjust where it's necessary, so either upwards or downwards. But then again, as I've mentioned, when it does come to financing, I think therein lies the challenge to make sure that the banks or whoever finances the property sees that value as well. But it does, you know, it does add value, definitely.
Good. And how quickly does a deeds office record update filter through to the Lightstone reports, Estiani?
So we get weekly updates from the deeds office, but the deeds office itself has a process. So we only import data from the deeds office once it's actually verified. So that's the very last step in the deeds office process, meaning that once it reaches us, you know, it can't be turned around. So the data is stamped, it's registered, it's validated in the deeds office. We get those on a weekly basis, and then we get a supplemental batch on a monthly basis as well, which will then capture anything that have fallen through, those weekly updates. But yeah, so generally what we would advise is that once a property has been validated by the deeds office, nothing more than 14 days after we will have it as live in our systems.
Okay. And Estiani, are the banks using Lightstone and comparable data in terms of their bond, scoring and assessments, bond application assessments?
Yeah. So that's part and parcel of the process. So what happens is as soon as an offer to purchase is submitted to the banks will look at the Lightstone report. And each bank or financial institution has a rules engine, what we call. So they've got their set of rules to say, this needs to be in place in terms of the accuracy and safety scores and all of that. And if it's above a certain percentage, as an example, this specific institution will say, look, we're happy to use the Lightstone, what we call desktop valuation, and we will grant bonds on that desktop valuation. So if let's say the ABSA rules engine says it has to be above 80% and the Lightstone valuation gives a 79% or 75% accuracy, then the bank will say, look, we're going to now send out a physical valuer to go and do the valuation on that property. So those are the two options for the banks at the moment, or the two things they look at, but they do use our systems to validate against the values and obviously property ownership as well.
Good. And is there any rental data in Lightstone, Estiani, or is it purely sales focused?
Yeah, at the moment, it's purely sales focused.
Okay. And South African focused, or are there other SADC countries that could be included?
No, not yet. It's only South Africa at the moment. We at one point in time we did look at. I remember it was about 7 years ago. We looked at Namibia to try and see if we can do the deeds there, but it was paper based, So it's very interesting to see that some of the African countries, as an example, don't have an electronic system like we have, which is phenomenal. I think we underestimate the value of the system that we currently have. So no, we don't have any data outside of South Africa within Lightstone.
Okay, great. Well, we are almost out of time. So, Estiani, I'd like to extend warm thanks to you for joining us tonight, for your feedback, for the data, for more insight into Lightstone. So it's very helpful to know what's available, how the data and reports can be used, and benefits for buyers and sellers alike to be informed of their own property investment or sales decisions. So thank you for joining us. We appreciate the feedback, and it's been very interesting. Just in closing, some useful links as a reminder. They'll be on the slides if you've asked for them. But like I said, there's extensive free training. There's legislation in searchable format in Word. There's lots of relevant questions which arise on a daily basis to our portfolio managers, where Karina's written very short one-page answers with legal references. Those are pretty helpful. And I think there's a next slide, Karine, just with our contact details. If we haven't touched on anything that you would like to have covered, if you have any outstanding questions, if there's anything troubling you in terms of scheme management or property, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'd be glad to come back to you. So good night, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. The short survey will pop up if you have time to complete, and we'll take the queue in terms of any topics you'd like us to cover going forward. Thanks again, Estiani, and good night, everybody. Bye-bye.